talented comrade of ours, and it's Comrade Y.C. Lee. Y.C. joined Socialist Action about a year ago following the launch of Eve Engler's book, Left Right, Marching to the Beat of Imperialist Canada. Most recently, he has participated in the Venezuela Solidarity Coalition and the No Pride in Police Coalition. YC's recording projects include Solo Messiah Project, Solo Recital Debut, and Solo Download Project. In addition, YC performs opera, oratorio, and art song favorites. Awards include a gold medal from the Royal Conservative of Music. His teacher is the esteemed Armenian baritone David Vargabet. So I hope that he's not here listening to what I do. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to YC.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. And I just want to say that my experience in Socialist Action has been very warm and welcoming ever since the first day I joined. And this was only a little bit over a year ago. I was never an activist before I came. And actually, I was very, very moved by Comrade Gary Porter. One of his first gestures was sending out an email to me. I'll never forget it. He said, "You know what, yeah, why don't you learn Carmina Burana?" I'm like, whoa, that's so cool. And we have an army of singers in Socialist Action besides Gary. Julius sings, Elizabeth sings, Emily Sears sings, Barry sings, Dirk Prout sings. So we have an army of singers here, and I encourage everyone, when you sing, when you play an instrument, when you produce music, it's been proven, it's been reported that it does change your brain function. So I'm not going to talk about Marx, I'm not going to talk about any of that because, you know, I'm here to tell you my story. And what else can I say? Oh yes, if you would like to listen to Messiah, I actually have some Messiah samples on, so you can just go on my website, porgiamor.strikingly.com, and it will take you to links and things like that. You can actually hear Messiah for free without having to pay. And that's the beauty of technology. After all we just discussed, the fact that technology should make our lives easier, right? So anyway, without further ado, I'm going to be singing the first piece. It links on to the previous discussion regarding environmentalism. And it is an aria about the nobility of plants and trees and how they are so gentle and how they provide shade, beautiful shade. And the second aria I will sing is about love. And it is possible to find love at first sight. And so that's what this second aria is about. Okay. My fool, di vegetabile corredamabile sove più di vegetabile
amabile ombra mai fu di vegetabile cara ed amabile soave più soave più respinge, cerca la stretta della mia man, la tua pupilla esprime non t'amerò.
Thank you so much, comrade. Thank you.
Turn it on, Elizabeth.
Oh, thank you so much, comrade. Okay, thank you, YC. That was wonderful,
Beautiful.
wonderful. Okay, so now we're going to go to our panel. And the title of the panel is Working Class Politics, The Crisis of the Labor Movement, Lessons of the Federal Election, and a Strategy to Win. And we have 3 speakers, and they will get up to 20 minutes each. And we're going to start with Barry Weisletter, who is a retired teacher, a union organizer, and chair of the NDP Socialist Caucus. He sought the NDP nomination in University of Rosedale, but was not vetted by the party brass. Surprise, surprise. He is a co-editor of Socialist Action newspaper and the author of several booklets, including The NDP and Socialism, The Power and Dilemma of Trade Unions, Prospects for Socialism in Canada, and Cannon's Concept of the Revolutionary Party. Barry is the Federal Secretary of Socialist Action Canada. Our second speaker is Comrade Durka Prout. She was the 2019 NDP candidate for London North Centre. Durka is a co-chair of the Federal NDP Women's Commission and a contributor to Turn Left, the Socialist Caucus magazine. She is a geotechnical engineer and president of the London chapter of the Spelling Bee of Canada. Durka was a 2017 recipient of the Ontario Leading Women Leading Girls Award. And our third speaker, as you've heard earlier, on another panel, is Yvonne Hanson. She's a committed advocate on the environment and equality, inequality. She's working with groups like Our Time, Force of Nature, and Extension Rebellion to push Canada forward on the biggest issue of our time. Born in Vancouver and raised in Squamish, Yvonne moved back to Vancouver after high school to attend post-secondary and earn a degree in political science from Simon Fraser University. Yvonne was the NDP candidate in Vancouver, Granville, and is a member of Socialist Action. So further ado, Barry, you have 20 minutes.
Well, good evening, comrades and friends. Are you enjoying the conference? I notice a number of you are having your dinner, so consider this, I hope, the dessert. I've been teaching, I've taught high school for 35 years, but let me assure you, this is not a civics class. Feel free to take notes. The only test will be life itself. I will talk about the federal election. First, let's consider what is working class politics. Well, it begins with the fact that society is class divided. There are two main classes. One, the working class, is at least 85% of society. We sell our labor power to survive. Workers and nature are the source of all wealth, but we possess nearly zero economic and political power. Two, the capitalist class, less than 1% of society, produce almost nothing and have nearly total control of the economic and political decision-making exercised through their state apparatus. The self-employed and managerial petty bourgeoisie, the intermediate 10 to 14% of the population, cling to the coattails of the capitalist class. They do its bidding. In a deep crisis, the petty bourgeoisie will split between the main classes, and most will go over to the working class if there is a mass revolutionary party. The capitalist state, I don't think I'm divulging any secrets, is not neutral. It performs an administrative and coercive role, but also an ideological one. It seeks to persuade workers that minority class rule is natural and permanent. However, we know as materialists that nothing is permanent but change. Fundamental change comes through class struggle. Of course, you can pray for higher wages. You can try to make a compelling moral or legal argument for social justice, but it's usually just more effective to go on strike.
Here, here.
To change society as a whole, not just to change one workplace or one neighborhood, the goal of the working class is to break the monopoly of political power of the capitalist class. That's why workers began to organize our own political parties in the 19th century. The first workers' parties were utopian and reformist, but soon revolutionary parties took to the field. That started with the Communist League, for which Marx and Engels wrote a rather famous manifesto in 1848, which I believe is on sale at the back. Followed by the First International, thank you, Gary. Followed by the First International in 1864, the Second or Socialist International in 1889, the Communist or Third International in 1919, and the Fourth International in 1938. Now, the reason for these successive parties is a talk for another time. Larry Zolf, a CBC TV journalist in the 1970s, used to tell a story about life in Winnipeg's North End. He said he grew up in a two-party system. Which two parties? The Cooperative Commonwealth Federation and the Communist Party. Well, the CP withered as it defended the Stalinist regime in the Soviet Union, and you're familiar pretty much with that story. The CCF went on to merge with the Canadian Labour Congress in 1961 to form the New Democratic Party in 1961. The NDP, like its counterparts in Britain, in Australia, New Zealand, is a bourgeois workers' party. So it embodies a contradiction. Bourgeois workers' party. That means it's based on workers' organizations. However, it is burdened with a pro-capitalist program and leadership. Party democracy would enable the working class to determine the program and the policies of the party rather than simply bow to the wishes of the parliamentary careerists and labor bureaucrats who dominate the organization. So the NDP, as I mentioned, embodies a contradiction, the conflict between labor and capital within its own structure. Socialists seek to resolve that conflict in favor of labor. That brings us to the October 21st federal election. From the standpoint of the working class, which is the vast majority of society, what happened and what is to be done? Well, the election aftermath offers some clues as to what happened. Andrew Scheer is fighting for his political life. Elizabeth May resigned as leader of the Green Party, and Justin Trudeau is looking for advisors in Western Canada. Trudeau will have to walk on eggshells in order to avoid defeat in the House of Commons. The knives are out for Conservative leader Andrew Scheer. That might seem odd, given that his party won a plurality of votes, and it gained 22 seats. But it's really not so odd when you think about it. When you consider the division inside the ruling class over how far and how fast to push austerity, and given their hatred for the climate justice movement. Did Justin Trudeau get what he deserved? Not nearly. Canadians chose on October 21st to slap down Justin Trudeau. The voters reduced the Liberal Party to minority government status with 1 million fewer votes than they got in 2015. As a result, there may be another federal election in 2 years or less. Still, Mr. Pretentious, Mr. Dress-Up of Parliament Hill, Mr. TMX Double Pipeline remains Prime Minister until he doesn't. What about Jagmeet Singh? Well, I seldom agree with Rex Murphy, but he made a good point when he wrote, and I quote, "Jagmeet Singh, by contrast, is being toasted, not roasted for his campaign. Objectively, this is strange. Under his leadership, the NDP were obliterated in Quebec, lost a massive chunk of seats, and were seen at one point in the campaign as threatened by the Greens. The latter should be seen as a shameful blot on any leader's record. Mr. Singh impressed mainly because his performance in the year and a half before the election was almost brilliantly dismal." Like that mixed metaphor. "Any change was necessarily for the better," close quote. The Labour-based New Democratic Party suffered heavy losses for the second election in a row. It emerged with 20 fewer seats and 511,000 votes less than it won in 2015. Yet it potentially holds the balance of power in Parliament. I underline the word potentially. When I first wrote a statement for the Socialist caucus after the election, I said, well, it's not so bad for the working class, the NDP has the balance of power. People corrected me on this point. So I underline the word potentially because, you know, the Tories and the Bloc Québécois will vote with the Liberals on some issues. So the NDP must turn up the volume and oppose the Liberals. Its working class base demands that the NDP agitate vigorously for no new pipelines, nationalize the energy industry, tax the rich, and provide restitution to Indigenous peoples. It ought to fight for head-to-toe Medicare now, cancellation of student debt, proportional representation, and an end to Canadian complicity with the US-led war drive, break with the bid to overthrow the elected government of Venezuela, and denounce the coup in Bolivia. It should demand cuts to the military, stop backing the Zionist apartheid state, and halt the supply of armored military vehicles to Saudi Arabia. You agree?
Yes.
NDP leader Jagmeet Singh avoided political oblivion with a late turn to the left. But how did his appointed top staff manage to drive the party down to 4th place from 20% of the votes in 2015 to a mere 15.9%? What effect did Singh's obstruction and manipulation of the local candidate selection process have? Did his efforts to block leftists undermine confidence in the campaign and impair fundraising? Well, the list of Singh's crimes is pretty long. It starts, at least, with while his gang ran the NDP Federal Convention in February 2018 in Ottawa. He kept a progressive resolution on Palestine off the floor, and he blocked every socialist policy proposal from debate. And there were many of them, and they got support from dozens of district associations across the country, but they didn't get to the floor. In May, he removed Sister Rana Zaman, a social activist and Muslim who was the NDP candidate in Dartmouth Coal Harbor, when she condemned the killing of Palestinians by Israeli forces during the protests in Gaza. She compared Israel to Nazi Germany, which was unfortunate, slightly exaggerated, but for which she apologized to no avail. He blocked the nomination of Robbie Mahood in Mount Royal, Sid Ryan in Oshawa, me here in University Rosedale, and other leftists across the country. He ordered Doc Curry in Kamloops Thompson Caribou to resign as candidate. Singh's henchmen appointed close to 100 candidates without a vote at a local NDP nomination meeting. Remember, Canada has 338 electoral districts. Over 100 were appointed. And when Singh campaigned in Burnaby South in the by-election held last February, media asked him, "Who is the president of Venezuela?" And he answered, "I don't know. It's up to the people of Venezuela." Well, the people of Venezuela voted in May 2018. They had 4 candidates for president on the ballot, and the voters elected Nicolas Maduro by a wide margin. And he ought to know that. He does know that. So the question arises, and someone asked me during the break, is it time for a leadership review? Well, the issue is on the agenda at every NDP convention. The question is, are we pushing it? Should we? And I would say, and we're going to have a discussion about this at our leadership meeting here tomorrow, it depends on the timing of the next NDP federal convention, frankly. Because a year or two from now, denial of the tyranny that reigns at the top will give way to discontent at the base. And we need to get ready for that. Indeed, we need to shape it. Still, the fact is that Singh is only a symptom of the problem. And we shouldn't be bedazzled by the personality. We should consider the bigger picture and the stakes. What does the election show? The election confirmed the long-term stagnation of the NDP, interrupted only briefly by the orange wave in 2011. The party brain trust proved incapable of engaging with rising, youthful, widespread anti-capitalist sentiment, nor with the progressive nationalist consciousness of the Québécois. This was painfully evident in an election dominated by climate change. Singh hesitatingly opposed the Liberals' Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion, but he endorsed the BC government's huge LNG plant and natural gas pipeline project. His very late version of a Green New Deal, sans public ownership of the energy sector, enabled the capitalist Green Party to win over many NDP voters. On Quebec, the party signified with its 2006 Sherbrooke Declaration that it endorsed Quebec's right to national self-determination. But the party continues to frame it within the existing 1867 model Canadian Federation, which severely limits the exercise of Quebec autonomy. Clearly, the bourgeois Bloc Québécois capitalized on this source of frustration, not just by condoning anti-Muslim Bill 21, which we condemn. They were getting at the question of jurisdiction and Quebec's self-determination, as it were. So the BQ captured many seats from the NDP in Quebec that deceased leader Jack Layton only briefly held. The NDP is yet to recover from former leader Tom Mulcair's austerity, his balanced budget mantra that squandered the 31% of the votes and the 103 seats that the NDP won in 2011. Jagmeet Singh impressed in the TV debates, but he spoiled it with his ridiculous election night peroration and then by floating the notion of a coalition with the Liberal Party, a poison pill for the NDP. Now, Justin Trudeau ruled out coalition. He will proceed to get his legislation passed with the support of one or another party in the Commons. And most parties are broke, so there's little appetite to trigger an election. Still, for the working class, it's important to be clear on the political principle at stake here. Participation in a liberal governing coalition with NDP ministers of the Crown would force the Labour-based party to champion all of the legislation of the corporate liberals. The NDP would be the tail wagged by a rather sick dog. Coalition with a capitalist party would undermine the independent interests of the working class even more than the despicable strategic voting policy of the Canadian Labour Congress. Instead of pondering participation in a bourgeois coalition, the NDP in Parliament should always be staunchly independent. It should, on a case-by-case basis, vote only for laws that benefit the working class and its allies. Outside Parliament, the NDP should mobilize millions of people against the corporate agenda. Cabinet cohabitation might net some opportunist politicians plum positions, but it would be an unmitigated disaster for the vast majority of people under the weight of a decaying capitalist world order now headed for another great recession. Labor leaders, too, must be held to account. Shamefully, the head of the Canadian Labour Congress backed the strike-breaking Liberals. If you're a postal worker, you know what I'm talking about. He backed the strike-breaking Liberals under the guise of strategic voting, and Unifor, which quit the CLC over union raiding, crossed the electoral class line too. The split in Labour reflects the crisis in which Labour leaders have capitulated to concessions bargaining and capitalist austerity, so as not to rock the boat. This is evident in the failure to organize mass job actions in support of the nurses in New Brunswick. This is reflected in the failure to support the victims of cuts in Ontario. It's reflected in the failure to support workers at 7 Crown corporations in Saskatchewan. And soon, or maybe now already, given the work to rule, the failure to support transit workers in British Columbia. The sellout of the NDP by a portion of the Labour leadership reflects the wholesale retreat of the Labour fakers. That's one reason why we in Socialist Action are part of the Workers' Action Movement. The banner there reflects the fact. WAM is running candidates for the executive of the Ontario Federation of Labour this month. The vote takes place in just about a week and a half. And why are we running? WAM is, I say what we in the sense that I'm part on the steering committee of WAM. WAM is an independent organization of rank and file militants. WAM is running candidates for the executive and for of the OFL, and also the plan is to run for the some executive positions in the Canadian Labour Congress next June in Vancouver. Wow. Class struggle leadership in the unions will put an end to class collaboration in the workplace, at the ballot box, and across society. Now, out of the election, there is something to celebrate. And that's the fact that the racist People's Party lost its only seat in the House of Commons and attracted less than 2% of the votes.
Woo! 3 minutes.
So that means
3 minutes.
Canada is not yet fertile ground for the rabid right-wing populism a la Trump. Of course, that won't stop the business elite from probing openings for the far left, for the far right. They will continue to push and prod, see if they can advance their agenda. At the same time, the undemocratic first-past-the-post electoral system showed, again, how bad it is. It grossly distorted the will of the voters. Is there a basis, however, for building a broad anti-capitalist electoral party, a new party? Is there some basis to launch such a thing? Well, you know, Quebec Solidaire, in a way, embodies that idea, and it showed some promise. But it is, our comrades in Quebec tell us, increasingly shifting towards conventional reformist politics. The election, both in English Canada and Quebec, showed one thing crystal clear. The parties that are to the left of the NDP got only 0.05% of the votes. So the spotlight is still on the terrain that the NDP and the unions occupy. That is the space that must be contested by the radical left in order to advance an anti-capitalist alternative. Happily, some positive developments did surface, and we see them among us. The NDP Socialist Caucus congratulated the many openly socialist candidates who increased the party's share of the vote locally. Dirk Prout in London North Centre, Justin McLean in North Simcoe, Matthew Green, who was elected in Hamilton Centre, Leah Gazan, who was elected in Winnipeg Centre, Yvonne Hansen in Vancouver Granville, Annie Ohana in Fleetwood Kells, and Stephen Crozier in Surrey White Rock. Right there. Not to mention re-elected Nikki Ashton in Churchill Kiwetanuk Aski in Manitoba. Now, sadly, Sven Robinson lost a close race in Burnaby South. But on the plus side, Sportsnet fired Don Cherry.
That race is out of here.
McLean should go too.
We can discuss how well related that is to the list, but I'm taking it with both hands. So, comrades, clearly the influence of socialists in the NDP is rising rather impressively. Furthermore, a minority government is advantageous to the fight against capitalist austerity, corruption, and authoritarianism. The working class on the left can salvage something from this election if there is an escalation of active mass resistance. As the postal workers proudly say, the struggle continues. La lutte continue. The rise of socialists in the NDP is a reflection of the new wave of popular revolts against austerity and authoritarianism on a world scale. Lula, the former president of Brazil and leader of the Workers' Party, is free.
30 seconds.
Fee increases in Chile and Ecuador were rescinded, and masses continue to protest and demand deeper change in those countries. Similar struggles are underway, unfolding day by day in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Kashmir, and we got the news earlier today about resistance to the coup in Bolivia. The right-wing coup in Bolivia is a setback, to be sure. But it's a product of relying on the neutrality of the capitalist state. But let's see if the grassroots can rise to the occasion and challenge the filthy racist right-wingers who seized power in the eastern part of that country. We all need to study the lessons of Cuba's socialist revolution. We need to step up solidarity with the workers of Venezuela. No to any right-wing coup, no pasarán. For independent working class politics, the tasks are clear. And I'll conclude with this. Build the NDP Socialist Caucus. Wham it to the bosses. Fight for a workers' agenda. Take the struggle to the streets for escalating job actions towards a general strike to dump Thug Ford. Out with Jason Kenney, Scott Moe, Francois Legault, and Blaine Higgs. Fight for socialism and feminism. Workers to power. Together we can win. Join Socialist Action.
Thank you very much. So Labor Day 2019 saw me attending London's rally and march to the London and District Labour Council's annual picnic, where I mingled with Labour activists, their allies, and my working class neighbours. Pumped up, once the picnic was over, I went canvassing in a nearby neighbourhood with Susan Smith, who's in the audience. As the darkness fell at the end of the canvass, I visited one last house where the conversation went like this. I really I love the NDP. But you guys simply cannot win. We can't have shares, so I'm voting Liberal. Strategic voting. It will be used as an excuse as to why our polling didn't match the final seat count. But I think the roots of our underperformance are far deeper than that. In order to win the hearts and minds of the Canadian electorate, we must first decide what is the NDP. The old adage is that the Liberals campaign left, yet rule right is valid. But what is equally true is that over the past 2 decades, we have slowly morphed into liberal light. Canadians will say, ain't nothing but the real thing, baby, and vote accordingly. Some will correctly point to being under-resourced as a major problem in this election, and they won't be wrong. However, I would say that in the lead up to this election, we failed to build a movement. Had we successfully engaged and listened to activists, we may have had less money worries. One good thing for our 2019 platform, it put much needed daylight between us and the Liberals. It also provided solutions to problems that Canadians sorely needed, like housing they can afford, head-to-toe healthcare, and real action on climate change. This platform is a great launch pad for the next election. But to capitalize on it, we must be organized, must organize, and must educate. So what is the NDP? Show of hands. Is it a movement?
Should be.
It
Should be, right. Is it a social democratic party? I'd say yeah. Is it a workers' party? It should be, right? Is it a socialist party?
No.
Definitely not. Possibly should be, yes. Who do we purport to be and to represent? Do we want to confront and replace capitalism, or are we just content to humanize it? Are we content to simply sit in opposition benches as the principal ones, as some people tell me we should be? Or do we want to achieve an electoral success in order to kickstart meaningful changes? That's a lot of questions, but I really can't answer them here. However, they must be answered so that we can proceed accordingly. Now, here's one thing I am sure of. We must build from the base we established in 2019, whatever that is. And I am among the fortunate few NDP candidates to be present when a national campaign was launched. You know, London has great institutions and is a fantastic place to reside. It's the home of many successful pioneering businesses and individuals, yet there is another London, and that other London is why I ran. One where despite a record low unemployment rate, our labor participation rate is one of the lowest in Canada. Worse, last week the London Free Press reported that a proportion of young people aged 15 to 29 not in school or work was a record 15%. This is 3 to 4% higher than similar mid-sized cities like Windsor, Kingston, and Guelph. London is or has experienced a severe loss of manufacturing jobs and is in the midst of a housing crisis and an opioid crisis. It's the perfect place to launch a campaign that promised to tax the rich. I firmly believe our platform, Jagmeet's solid debate performances and a strong ground game helped us to keep London Fanshawe orange, resulted in an increased vote share in my riding of London North Centre and the 2 other London area ridings. But in preparation for our next and all future campaigns, we must continue to expose the concentration of political and economic power with the 1%. However, to truly capture the hearts and minds of the masses beset by inequality and staring down the cataclysm of climate change, we must provide hope with an alternate vision of Canada. Criticism of the Liberals and Conservatives, though warranted, is not enough. At the doors, people often told me they were tired of the bickering on Parliament Hill. They wanted politicians of all stripes to work together. Did you experience that, Yvonne? Yeah? Or of course, yeah? Yeah. So they wanted us to work together and each of us articulate what we were going to do to fix things. Obviously, this is best done in a parliament enhanced by electoral reform. But as Luke Savage commented on an October 2019 article in Jacobin magazine, and I quote, that the Liberal Party has so dexterously oscillated between progressive rhetoric and centre-right governance for decades is a testament to the breathtaking staying power of Canada's elite centre. And until the NDP develops a lasting countermeasure, there will be undoubtedly many more 1968s, 1988, 2050, and 2019s. My suggested countermeasure, we know that at the heart, the current NDP is a social democratic party. Therefore, our role as socialist members is to make sure the party focuses resolutely on providing radical solutions to the challenges Canadians face. These solutions must be rooted in social principles and invoke a human rights framework. No longer can we rest on the laurels of minority government achievements of bygone eras. We must form government, and the only way we can do that is to start. Forming government is the only way that we can transform the structures that prioritize corporations and the rich over you and I. Be aware that transformation of social political structures built to maintain neoliberal, neocolonial, imperialist, and capitalist control only buys us time. And buys time for what, you may ask? For our activists to work with people and build new replacement institutions that provide for a sustainable environment for people and the planet. The NDP's countermeasure has to fight on two fronts. We must strive for political power, yes. However, our actions must be informed from the bottom up by the will of the people. Being in tune with the will of the people will require creation of and listening to an active and vibrant movement. So building a movement is a necessary condition for confronting and replacing capitalism, as Barry has said. As happened in Ontario, we lost.
Batteries.
You can grab another mic. Where is it? There it is.
And there's batteries in the box, if you want to replace these.
Okay. That's all right. All right, was not your song. So, building a movement is a necessary condition for confronting and replacing capitalism. As happened in Ontario under Bob Rae, Alberta under Rachel Notley, and Bolivia under Evo Morales, centrist and right-wing operatives will mobilize swiftly and relentlessly to quickly dispose of socialist governments. So therefore, we need an antidote to impediments to us sustaining political power. A personal touch will be key. So during my campaign, I went into working class neighborhoods and lower middle class neighborhoods, and particularly multi-unit developments where I believe previous campaign teams from all parties had neglected. My campaign manager reported receiving several phone calls from people expressing gratitude that we had stopped at their door. Some even told me this when I canvassed. So each time I heard it, I felt a mix of joy at being the first of the door and sadness that other parties took these citizens for granted. We honor those who we plan to serve by coming to them. By all accounts, the NDP ran an excellent social media campaign during the election. A prudent move given our cash-strapped position and the need to reach out to a younger demographic. Social media and ad buys are no substitute for face-to-face interactions. You know, you learn so much from people experiences when you directly speak to them. Some stories were difficult to hear, I must say, and others were uplifting. But a lot of Londoners truly care for each other, no matter what their station in life. It is important that we grow our grassroots, as this will allow us to be more in sync with them. The movement should be a broad coalition of activists, all a call to the struggle, all, as long as they are committed. So beyond union members, we need to utilize existing connections and build stronger alliances with organizations committed to social justice, human rights, indigenous rights, environmental stewardship, economic equality, and as such to inform our policy. We in turn should support their causes. So many of the problems the working class faces in Canada are not borne by us alone. Therefore, to produce a more resilient and informed movement, and I say this in light of what is going on in South America right now, we must cross borders and build international solidarity. The party could create an international solidarity office. In this way, research and tactics could be shared with our counterparts worldwide. Our bonus feature of this initiative is that we could ground truth struggles in foreign countries and present the truth that mainstream media cannot. The imperialists have a globalized front, and so should we. You know, this election, there were about 100 or so ridings which did not win 10% of more the vote. And I'm talking about NDP riding associations, to be specific. These ridings will not receive a rebate for the 2019 election, and that's sad. Now, in structural engineering, and you must remember that I'm an engineer, we try to make sure that the weakest connection is strong. So the party brass typically cherry picks ridings at election time to grace with increased attention and funds. And, to some extent, this might be a good strategy, but instead of only catering to priority ridings during the writ period, the NDP should put more effort into supporting weak ridings between elections. So successful deployment of our countermeasure requires an organized party. Organization to build a robust grassroots movement and inoculation of the masses with education. This activity must occur year-round. The processes and related tactics of organization and education must be recalibrated with shifts in economic, demographic, and social norms. In an October 22nd post on his Facebook site, Sid Ryan cited the lack of preparation as a major reason for underwhelming performance in this campaign. This disorganization severely compromised our fundraising, vetting, and overall election readiness. Some of this, I believe, stems from a lack of institutional knowledge. Now, you have to remember that the party's senior leadership, ranks, and resources were depleted after suffering heavy losses in 2015. And this worsened after Mulcair's subsequent departure. However, there is no excuse for not doing the work to regain the trust of the members, and this is a prerequisite for establishing a successful fundraising campaign. Nor does it explain Jagmeet's reluctance to visit Saskatchewan and extend an olive branch to disaffected members after ousting of Erin Weir. The reason why he never visited New Brunswick is a mystery known only to him. Then there was the vetting debacle. Expect multiple riding associations to submit resolutions at next year's convention on this matter. Although in the end we completed our nominations before the incumbent Liberals and delivered the most diverse slate, the entire nomination process still requires a detailed examination. Organization of the grassroots movement should occur at two levels. So one is a planned effort by the riding association with resources and funding provided by the central party. I suggested during the campaign, to Grassroots, Courage, and Socialist Caucus that members and executives of strong riding associations should offer executives of weak neighboring EDAs support. However, as was rightly pointed out to me, our efforts would be limited if the central party does not support our efforts, our grassroots efforts. So the second level of grassroots movement organizing should be decentralized. It's necessary, I think, to protect our activists on the ground. These grassroots efforts operating at the member and or EDA level are quite important. The integrity and success of both levels requires the party brass to respectfully listen to, support, and assist in the advancement of causes members and allied activists champion. So fake news does exist. For example, I was frustrated at how many times while canvassing I met individuals who thought Canada spent too much on foreign aid. The truth is that the Liberals' spending on foreign aid represents a 50-year low for Canadian government. Less than one-third of 1 penny out of every dollar goes to foreign aid. That's next to nothing. And our activists should be given the tools to educate, to inoculate against alternative facts. Inoculation is a two-step process. Warn that certain right-wing parties and think tanks spread lies, like the Fraser Institute. Then debunk their arguments and follow up with a socialist fix that protects their people and our environment.
3 minutes.
3 minutes. I'm gonna, Can I get a little bit extra? I'm gonna just go.
Sure.
I just want to bring a few.
3 minutes, okay? Another 3 minutes? 6
Yeah, I would be less than that, but I hope. So investment is a key, education, sorry, is a key investment for our party. It allows us to explore what policy options look like. So for example, this is just one example, right? This election, housing was a big topic. And if we say that housing is a human right, then we need policy solutions that fit that. We need solutions that erase the commodification of housing. What about a public land trust? What about funds to maintain those housing? No party, including ours, talked about that. And how do we shape this housing to fit the needs of people who are disabled? Women who typically had single family households. Urban indigenous people, not just, there was talk about housing on reserves, but what about indigenous people who live in the cities, right? They have housing issues too. Socialist policies, socialist solutions based on socialist principles and human rights, they may not resemble anything that we have now, right? So trying to create buy-in during a campaign is damn near impossible. Effective policy only is informed by persons, I wrote this by hand, not typed it. So effective policy is only fully implemented if informed by persons who are not only academic experts, but people on the ground with lived experience. So we need to build good class solidarity to do that. We need to help the public understand even the electoral system. There were a lot of times people told me things, and I don't know if the other two candidates experienced this, that really were municipal issues, not federal issues. But there's so much more. Some of them I don't think even understand the NDP. So the fifth thing that education does is assist in development of the next generation of activists. Economic and environmental sustainability is something we are championing, and therefore we should look after sustainability in the movement as well. So now I'm going to close. I'm not finished. Tonight, I briefly touched on a few of the problems with the NDP's recent campaign. In 2019, we had an ineffective response to strategic voting and were disorganized in the lead up to the election. This disorganization compromised our fundraising, nomination processes, and overall election readiness. This left us susceptible to the scourge of strategic voting and a broken first-past-the-post system. The bright spot, if you can call it that, is our leader captured the respect of Canadians, despite being racialized and wearing articles of faith. We also correctly identified the enemy and offered a platform that put much-needed daylight between us and the Liberals. We should continue to confront the imperialist, colonizing, and moneyed classes who leave us underhoused, discriminated against, living in debt bondage or poverty on an environmentally challenged planet. A well-organized, well-funded NDP is certainly needed, and one with succession planning in place so that it can continually develop youth into future leaders. Guided by socialist principles, the NDP should fight for power in order to transform society. Policies and tactics should flow upward from its activists, and grassroots organizations should be the countermeasure to strategic voting. Now, there may be other countermeasures. It is at the grassroots level that a socialist vision and new progressive institutions for a future Canada should be built. To win, the NDP must define itself, build a movement, be organized, organize 365 here and abroad, and educate to inoculate. Then follow up with socialist fixes. My challenge to you is to pick one action from my talk or others on this panel that you will commit to until the next election to improve the outcome. Thank you for listening and for the extra time.
So I didn't write much, which is why I was fine with donating some extra time. But I do have a few things to say, particularly about a strategy moving forward, and also some reflections on the election. I ran in Vancouver Granville, which was Jody Wilson-Raybould's riding. So everybody kind of saw how it was going to go. So, I mean, my riding was a bit of an outlier, but a great deal of ridings did gain NDP support in Vancouver, which was great. We did lose Quebec, which I don't think many of us really have any illusions as to why. I think it was a lot of racism and prejudice that went into that loss. That was something that was, it came up very often on the doors in the very sort of old and very white neighborhood that I was canvassing in Vancouver Granville was, okay, yeah, I love Jagmeet, he's a great guy, but, he's just got a turban, like, it's like, yeah, yeah, he does. Well, Canada's not ready, and it's like, sounds like you're not ready. I'm ready, I'm Canada, so. So yeah, that's, I think, why we had such a catastrophic loss in Quebec. That said, I think I would be happy if Jagmeet stayed on as leader, and I think I disagree with Barry here. I think he's a little bit more radical than he lets on, just based on personal conversations with him, based on his family history, the actions of his brother, that picture of his brother holding up a sign that says, "Fuck the police." And he showed an ability to learn and adapt as the campaign went on that I have not seen in other NDP leaders, particularly the provincial NDP leader. And I know provincial NDP is usually a pretty different animal than federal NDP. In BC, they're a lot more liberal than the federal NDP. But in this situation, I mean, John Horgan continuously says, and this is very nitpicky, I'm sorry, but continuously says, ladies and gentlemen, and a woman's right to choose. And this is language that is very gendered, which in the leftist community, especially in Vancouver, puts a lot of people off. And he never learned his entire campaign, John Horgan never did. But Jagmeet Singh, the first time I heard him speak about a woman's right to choose, I was like, I made note of that. And then the next time I heard him speak, he said a person's right to choose, which kind of showed me like, okay, look, he is listening. He does have his finger on the pulse of what people are saying about him, and he is adapting his behavior and his language to match that, which I think is extremely valuable in a leader. That said, he's really bad on Palestine, really weak on Palestine, and really terrible when it comes to things like LNG and just the blatant contradictions that a $42 billion mega project in the fossil fuel industry has with the climate action plan. He says BC has a really bold climate action plan and the LNG project fits in with that. Well, I just, absolutely disagree. But, he does piss off Tom Mulcair and his supporters, which is another thing that I'm pretty happy about. But, so I kind of want to reflect, running as a young person in the federal election, there was a constant ageism. And when we talk about the climate action movement, we talk about all the young people and like how great it is to see them come out. And the issue there is that it's not a very political movement. And, young people are getting involved in action, in political action, but not in the political structure, the political infrastructure, which, it's going down the same road as the Occupy movement went down, where you have this movement that has so much energy and so much passion and commitment and no leadership and no strategic direction. And, it burns itself out. And I am so worried that that's going to happen to the climate activist movement if it doesn't get that really vital political involvement, that political bent. But I'll talk more about that in a second. Another kind of thought that I want to talk about is the green threat. And in my riding, the only party that actually gained votes, like all parties lost votes to Jody, like NDP included, except for the Greens. The Greens actually gained like 300 votes, which for the Greens in Vancouver Granville was pretty substantial. And it's really tempting to see that as like, oh no, like the Greens are taking over, they're gonna like completely parasitize our voter base, and in the current electoral system that's completely possible. In a pro-rep system, it would be really encouraging to see the Greens, despite their terrible capitalist undertones and inherent racism, it would still be encouraging to see them, taking votes from the Liberals, taking votes from the Conservatives, which they do. But we don't have a pro-rep system. In other countries, like Germany and Ireland and other places where pro-rep is a thing, they form coalition governments, and coalitions are extremely common. You have a bunch of very small parties that get together and accomplish common goals. And with the Greens, we do have a lot of common goals. We have a lot that would be very opposed to each other. But I can see, a coalition government in a proportional representation system as being overwhelmingly beneficial to at least the climate action movement, which is very important to me. So it was disappointing to see Jagmeet Singh come out talking about his main demands of the Liberal government being pharmacare and Indigenous rights, both of which are very important and very exciting, but not talk about proportional representation, because the entire campaign, the one thing that I was saying to Liberals, I was like, look, Jagmeet, he says that he'll, form a coalition with the Liberals and he'll make proportional representation one of his big things, and then we can get more next time. We can do better next time, and it's not being talked about. And it's so frustrating, because that is one thing that is really holding the left back in Canada, is strategic voting and fear of the Conservatives. Something like 35% of people who voted Liberal say that they voted strategically, which is huge. That's a huge percentage. And in the proportional representation system, in the first past the post system, something like 50% of votes don't actually count towards the winner. So if 50% of votes are just getting thrown out and 35% of votes for the winning party are just being voted for out of fear, how much of a democracy is that? It's not. Our democracy is not functioning like it should be, and the left is the one suffering. So I feel strongly about that one. So the strategy moving forward. I have a lot of experience in the climate action movement, as you heard from my bio, and it's overwhelmingly apolitical. A lot of the people in the climate action movement are, I'll give you kind of a case study. I have a friend. She is a climate activist. She's a vegan. She is in school. She's doing writing. She writes for Cannabis Magazine. And she's in the climate action movement. And we were having a conversation. And she was telling me that she was planning to vote green. And I was like, no, girl, you don't want to vote green. They've got capitalist undertones. And I kind of went into, some of the points against them, anti-abortion kind of stuff. And she's like, oh, okay, well, I'll vote NDP then. And I almost felt kind of bad there for a second, because I was like, wait, no, I'm really biased. You should go research, because but that was how easy it was to kind of sway her. It was just like that. She didn't have any deep held political commitments, political allegiances. She just had deeply held beliefs about what was right in the world. And that is quite a large component of the environmentalist movement, the climate action movement, is they don't have deeply held political beliefs. They have deeply held principles. So it's directionless. It's similar to the Occupy movement. It's leaderless. It's devoid of kind of strategy. And, we want GHG emission reductions, but what concrete steps do we want? We don't talk about nationalizing infrastructure. We don't talk about seizing banks. Those things never come up in activist discussions. Another bit of it is that it's very based on direct action, getting out in the streets, kind of the artistic and expressive side of participation in the political community. And it's very young. There's, most of the rooms that I'm in, nobody is over 30. It looks like a university classroom without a professor. And, in one group, Courage Coalition, the West Coast branch, we have one lady, and she's 70. The rest of us are all under 30. She's our socialist mom. And she sews everything, and she always provides the snacks. She's lovely. But getting these two movements united. Pardon? No, I love Penny. She's amazing. But my point is that there is an age gap between the socialist movement and the climate action movement, and where does that age gap come from? I think a lot of it is kind of this intergenerational struggle that we're seeing, which I see as kind of being another way to be distracted from the class struggle that actually needs to be taking place instead. It's boomers against millennials instead of capitalist class against working class people. And that's really tearing the movement apart. It's tearing the solidarity apart. So what do I see in the socialist movement? And I gotta tell you, I'm coming from the socialist movement in Vancouver, which is a little bit different maybe than the socialist movement in Toronto. But in Vancouver, what I've noticed is that there's a lot of prerequisite knowledge required to join. So how many of you would be upset if somebody came in and they didn't know who Lenin was? probably a lot, because that seems like pretty important prerequisite knowledge. You don't know who Trotsky is, you don't know who Marx is. But a lot of the people in the climate activist movement don't know who those people are. And so they wouldn't feel welcome or wouldn't feel like a part of the socialist movement, which is super unfortunate. It's also focused on educating, which is very important, but focused on educating and talking about sort of socialist scriptures over talking about how direct action will happen. So, and it's also very insular and not reaching youth in Vancouver. So what can we do to unite the movements? Because we need to unite the movements. We really need to get that network building going. My number one bit would be focus on network building. We need to canvass. We need to canvass at climate strikes. That's how we do it. We need to bring clipboards. We need to bring petitions. We need to bring pens. We need to pass them around. That's like number one. Number two is team building. One of my favorite parts of the climate activist movement is how much team building goes into it. There's art builds, there's social nights, there's direct action events where you get to go and shout at police and sit in the streets with a bunch of your friends, which is a lot of fun. And it's more than just coming to discuss things. You're going to do something with your hands, and that gives people kind of a conduit for all of that anger and fear and depression and just sort of radical energy that they feel. So, climate strikers,
You're turning off the lights, BJ. Stop leaning on them.
is this your way of telling me to get out of here?
Don't lean on those lights, please.
I didn't realize the lights were there. I'm sorry.
So essentially what I'm saying is that the socialist movement lacks energy and the climate movement has energy in excess, which is why we need to combine. We need to get out and do really direct, immediate actions. On October 7th, the climate activist movement Extinction Rebellion orchestrated a bridge, Take the Bridge action, which was global. I participated in it in Vancouver. It was awesome. We brought tents and vegan food and a campfire, and we set up right in the middle of the most, strategically important bridge in Vancouver. And we stayed there all day until the police came and removed us. And like playing street hockey in the middle of the Burrard Street Bridge, wow, that feels real good. So what's next? We need to start kind of combining socialist goals with climate action movement, direct action style protesting. I want to take a bank or a post office or some other institution like a court or a law office. Something more than just a bridge, something more than just public infrastructure. We should be focusing on looking at the private interests and looking at what they own in our cities and what institutions they have their fists kind of dug into and how we can take those back. And yeah, there will be a lot of people arrested. Like that's kind of the point of Extinction Rebellion in the UK for some reason, but that will be a consequence, but we need to step it up. We need to introduce socialist goals of nationalizing infrastructure to the climate action movement and use that climate action energy to get those accomplished. Thank you.
Open up the floor for speakers now, and it's the usual format, 3 minutes. Okay. Just a minute. It's like 3 hands so far. Okay, Robbie, you keep playing tricks on me.
Who's
Tom,
going
did I
first?
see your hand? Okay. Yes, I got you, John. You're the first speaker. He's not going to let me forget about it. I missed his hand last time. BJ, I got you a long time ago. Okay. No. You're not on the list yet. Wait, sister. You keep your hand up, and I have you down.
I can't keep my hand up, it's disabled.
You don't have to. Once you put it up, I see it, and your name goes down.
Okay, thank you.
I have you, Claudia. Okay, so let's go. John.
That's very interesting, Yvonne, that you mentioned at the very end about nationalizing infrastructure, because what I have to say is directly related to that. If we need to defend and promote the interests of the working class, the NDP and the labor movement has to know what some of the most important things that are going on in Canada right now, especially in regarding finance. And something's flying under the radar, I think, a bit. And that's the Canada Infrastructure Bank. It's up and running. It was set up in 2017. So This bank will rip off taxpayers. They will have a massive transfer of wealth in interest payments to hedge funds, capital funds, to banks, to pension funds, and they'll even end up privatizing parts of new infrastructure like ports and bridges and roads and public building. So who's behind this? Well, the finance minister, Marleau. Marleau is from Marleau and Chappelle, multi-billion-dollar capital investment firm. Do you know he's married into the McCain family? His wife is a McCain, one of the richest families in all of Canada. Who are his friends? Oh, the McKinsey Fund. He was on a first-name basis with Fink of the largest hedge fund in the world, BlackRock. So he formed this advisory council, and they decided they're going to set up this infrastructure bank. And supposedly what the infrastructure bank is going to do, it's going to leverage public funds by having private funds piggy bank on top of infrastructure projects. This is all bullshit because we don't need anybody piggybacking on government building our infrastructure. Nobody can borrow money at a lower interest rate than a bank through bonds or through simply spending their revenue. What they want to do is transfer interest on payments of new loans to his private friends. At what? A lower interest rate? No, a higher interest rate. This adds up to billions of dollars. Not only that, they're going to put into the contract that maybe these private lenders will own some of the infrastructure.
30
so they're
seconds.
actually he plans to go in reverse. He wants to privatize through the back door with this Canada Infrastructure Bank. And the labor movement and the NDP has to become aware of it because they're just getting ready now to hand out some of these loans in these conditions. And we got to find out about it and expose them.
Okay, Claudia?
Yeah, well, thank you, the three of you, for a sort of an inspiring invitation to action. I guess my question is pretty much for Yvonne, because it's encouraging for me to see, people your generation becoming involved in actually trying to take power, trying to take state power. And my question, Yvonne, was, what do you think, or why do you think, or what can be done about what I observe in my own, work, practice as a professor at the university is sometimes students are, the state of affairs is so normalized that it's very, very difficult to help them imagine alternatives. And let me tell you a brief example was recently a strike on the issue of cuts for education in the postgraduate sector, and the call was to, reduce the cuts, or something like, stop the cuts, and it was, of course, pushed to the end of the campus, and virtually, very few people showed up. And last year we had a big strike at York University, you may know. And I didn't see calls for free education, just reduce the debt, and and I come from a background where I didn't pay a penny to go to medical school, and it, there were a lot of other problems. But anyway, so what do you think one can do to what I think is a younger generation that maybe doesn't quite, at least to some degree, have the capacity to imagine alternatives, radical alternatives. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Robbie?
Well, just a bit of information about the election and the performance of the NDP in Quebec. Just a few brief comments. There were a number of candidates in Montreal who one could describe as progressive and left-leaning, if not socialist. 3 or 4 really in total, including some who are very strong on the Palestinian question, who escaped the dragnet. So that was a plus, and I worked in the campaign for one of them. However, on the whole, The NDP campaign was highly centralized and pretty lifeless, really, on the in terms of anything significantly progressive. Even there was practically no attempt to project the left programmatic turn on Medicare and Green New Deal, such as it is, and those were positive adjustments of the NDP's program, certainly, but they weren't put into action. And you know, the example here is, I don't want to tout the horn of Quebec Solidaire, because there's lots of problems there too, but in terms of the electoral terrain, Quebec Solidaire ran a very energetic and I suppose imaginative campaign. They put their program up in poster form. The NDP in this election did none of that. Didn't even have that in their imaginary, and ran a largely personality-driven campaign based on Jagmeet and based on their deputy, Quebec deputy Alexandre Boulris, who did retain his seat. I mean, to his, I suppose it's indicative at least that the NDP has made some partial progress on the Quebec question, because Jagmeet resisted quite a bit of pressure to join up in challenging Legault's Bill 21, that Ottawa should challenge it through the court, should launch a, I don't know how that played in English Canada, but I know that I had several arguments with
30 seconds.
With some of my contacts in English Canada who are rather partial to this idea that English Canada should get into the act and discipline the Québécois for their racism, which I think would be a very bad error. And Jagmeet seemed to recognize that, so I give him credit there. But on the whole, I thought it was, from the Quebec standpoint, a pretty lackluster and depoliticized campaign, centrally and bureaucratically run for the most part.
Okay. The other side, BJ.
There seems to be a general trend for privatization over the past 20 or so years, including with the not only the P3s for hospitals and whatnot, but in the healthcare system particularly. And this is going to be a big issue next week at the Ontario Health Coalition Conference in Toronto. All of you are invited to attend. In terms of the capitalist system, there's a lot of emphasis upon reducing the debt. Right now there's a lot of deficits. With regard to climate change, I just wanted to report that in Guelph we had a whole over a week of actions from the 20th to 28th. It was basically carried by Extinction Rebellion, Guelph and area, including Kitchener, and I was the only NDPer on the committee. Climate change, let me see now. I forgot what I wanted to say.
Okay, let's see. Yeah, we've got still 3 more speakers, but I think I'll go back to the, 4 more speakers. I'll go back to take 1 more speaker, and then I'll go back to the.
1 minute.
You remembered? Okay. 1 minute.
I'd like to recommend a book. It's called Kicking the Fossil Fuel Habit, Saving Planet Earth. I think the author is Brandt. It should be available at the library. It's excellent. 10 technologies to save planet Earth. Actually, it has more like 30 ideas, and it was written in 2010. The technologies are there. We just need the political will to bring them into existence as far as energy is concerned.
Okay, thank you. So we're taking 1 more speaker, and then we're coming back to the panel. Tom.
Hamilton was quite involved in Matthew Green's campaign, which was quite an attraction for the entire progressive left and environmentalists, and housing activists, you name it. It was like a giant umbrella of positive things in the city of Hamilton. Matthew Green had been a alder or councilman, whatever, alderman, I don't know what they're called now, councillor in Hamilton, and had built quite a movement around that position. It's a very diversified group. A lot of the young Palestinians are quite involved, young black activists. It really was a different looking party. There were still a few of us, shall we say, more experienced folks around, but the energy and the central thrust of the campaign was definitely the youth. Muhammad Ali was down to perform a couple of the rallies, extremely high energy, a lot of engagement from the Aboriginal community in the city of Hamilton, as well as Six Nations people coming in to help. So very successful. I think the vote went up 15%. I think it was 45% of the vote or something like that Matthew Green got. So this was a passing over of a dynasty from David Christopherson, and there was some question because David's apparent popularity as the work he had done over the years, there was some concern whether some young upstart like Matthew Green would be able to capture that, but didn't seem to be a difficulty. And there was a lot of content to the campaign. Matthew's very, very open with the left in general. I think Barry told me he's subscribing to Socialist Action now, and he's certainly very open to discussions. He's very much learning politically, and whenever he goes to Ottawa, he likes to take a busload with him, and I think next week he's getting sworn in or something, and he's taking a busload of people to see this ceremony.
Okay, we're going to come back to the panel, and they get each up to 5 minutes, and we're going to start with Yvonne, then Barry, then Durka.
We can bring that over to the table.
Yes, so why don't you do that, Barry?
Well, Dirk is closer. Yeah, the whole thing.
That's
Your
perfect.
choice.
So the first question that I wrote down was the state of affairs is so normalized that in a lot of people's minds that it's difficult to get young people to imagine viable alternatives. And yeah, I've in a point now where like my social media sphere is so left-wing that I'm just like, everybody's on the left. And I talk to someone who's not, I'm just like, what do you read? Like, when you go online, what are you reading? I think there is kind of an online battle happening to educate young people, and it's being waged by other young people. It's done through really visual imagery, very short form, like soundbite type information. And I think those are kind of tools that we can use as activists and as leftists, distill the message to something that can essentially be a soundbite or a series of soundbites. Distill the message to something that can be represented in a picture or through, metaphor and illusion, because that's sort of the language that a lot of like 21st century political ideological building is taking place in online. I know it sounds silly to say that like memes are affecting our political culture in Canada, but they like 100% are. So using that power and harnessing that power is something that I think the left has been missing out on this year. I've been seeing a lot of great kind of upstart left-wing memes and online news sites that deliver blog-style articles about left-wing policy, which is great, and that's kind of a momentum that needs to continue, and that I think we can all kind of have a role in shaping just by augmenting those messages and interpreting them and then teaching them in that form, because that's what's salient. And then, was the NDP running a lackluster campaign? Was it very centralized? In the beginning, it was definitely really frustrating, trying to get anything out of the party. But I do have a little bit of hope, and that comes from the fact that after 2015, a lot of the sort of bigwig political insiders, the careerists, the hacks, left the party. They, jumped ship, which it left the party really damaged and really broken, but it also left the party without as many hacks, which was nice in some ways. So this election was very much about repairing that damage, and we went into the beginning of the campaign in that damaged state, and we didn't pick up a lot of steam for a very long time, and it was really, weighed on you. But I think towards the end of the campaign, I at least did start to feel a lot of sort of warmth from Central. We had an organizer who was very left-wing, and he came in and he saw our Courage Coalition banner, and he was like, "Hey, nice banner." And I was like, "You're one of us." And that was really great. So I think, as the next campaign goes, the NDP is campaigning right now. They are fundraising right now, which is awesome. My EDC, as well as quite a few other EDCs in Vancouver, are talking about continuing to campaign because we think that an election is imminent, after 2 years. And I'll tell you, after 2 years, because pensions for parliamentary people only start after 6 years in office. So everybody who was elected in 2015 has an incentive to stay in office for at least 2 more years. So I give it 2 years minimum. And then hopefully after that, we'll see, more of a spirited, energetic campaign now that those ranks can be filled out by people like us here in this room. Yeah.
Okay. Barry. 5 minutes.
I'm going to respond to some of the things that my co-panelists said. I didn't get a direct question, but I think that there are some really good ideas that are part of the discussion now that we need to continue to consider. Durga, I thought your suggestion of an international solidarity office is right on the mark. I think that would kickstart the NDP leadership to take more seriously foreign affairs and to speak up without fear on foreign affairs. The party has policy adopted at convention. In fact, the party was once upon a time opposed to Canada's participation in NATO. And that was, what do you call that when the sun goes down? Sunset. It was sunset. Turn that noun into a verb. It was sunsetted so that it just disappeared without a discussion, without a vote. I think it needs to be revisited and reasserted. Supporting the work of the weaker electoral district associations is very important, but it really speaks to a larger issue, and that is how to build the workers' movement between elections. Elections are just one moment in the class struggle. It's important to conceive of ways to not only support weaker EDAs with polling and with organizers to prepare the next canvas, but also to hold local educational forums, to hold events in which the NDP takes the stand in support of tenants who are fighting bad landlords, who are fighting for workers who are trying to raise their wages, to organize themselves. The NDP should be seen as a partisan and not above the fray, which all too often seems to be the case. Yeah, the nomination process is going to attract a lot of resolutions, I can guarantee it, because the Socialist Caucus will hold a conference to which we hope you're able to attend, and everyone here and many others, to consider what we're going to do in going into the federal convention. We need to be prepared in terms of policy, and a critical examination of the nomination process, which was quite farcical in many cases, is definitely a high priority. The problem with Jagmeet Singh is not his personality or his diction. He's a leader of a current in the Canadian workers' movement that defends capitalist property relations. He exercises a highly centralized control over the party apparatus and all of its mechanisms, including policy development. So when we attempted to bring a widely supported pro-Palestine resolution,
35 writings.
That resolution was supported by 35 local district associations, that's the term they use now. And we couldn't get it to the floor. And the resolution that did come to the floor, guess how many district associations it had the support? One. So that reflects, a style of leadership? No, it reflects the factional control of one particular current within the workers' movement, which says, we own the party, and we own the trade union connection, and we're going to decide what you can discuss. And that's just not on. But I'm convinced, because of what happened at the federal convention, the demonstration we saw on the floor of the convention, do you remember? 100 young people stood in a line right across the middle of the hall, holding up posters showing the young Palestinian woman who was slapped and abused by Israeli defense forces, Israeli Zionist occupying military, in the West Bank. And that was a moment that it just sent chills up and down my spine. Like, this was the revolt of the ranks. And I'm convinced as of that moment that we will win the policy on Palestine at the next federal NDP convention. There's no doubt in my mind. We will get it to the floor and we will win that policy. Jagmeet Singh cannot get away with refusing to address foreign policy. And the answer, I don't know who the president of Venezuela is, just totally unacceptable. It denies the intelligence of his audience. In fact, the only foreign policy that he would address, partially, was the question of foreign aid, which I have to respectfully argue is problematic. Because foreign aid, in most of the forms it takes in the less developed countries, simply guarantees a market for Canadian corporations. It says, here's some money, now you hire some Canadian corporations to send you some commodity, to send you some advisors, to send you some engineers and other folks and materials, and you build stuff that we'll own, right? It's not quite at the level of the Belt and Road campaign of the Chinese bureaucracy, but it's pretty darn close. The NDP should promote mass action, like the initiatives of Extinction Rebellion. It should be a party of the streets, not just the party of the ballot box, and we have to fight for that. There's a real appetite in the NDP for socialist policies, and we saw this reflected in the radical candidates, like on this panel beside me and in the hall, and we're going to see a lot more of that, and we're going to win if we continue the struggle. Let's get organized.
So I'm a civil engineer and work in infrastructure. And one of my big beefs is the politicizing of infrastructure. So a couple things on that. I'll just use maybe Toronto as an example. Let's use the subways, right? Engineers are trained and planners and stuff to make these decisions based on evidence and data and stuff. It takes a lot of time. There are multiple consultants involved. And inevitably, you'll start off with a ballpark estimate, but then you have to wait on all the governments to put aside money to approve the project. By that time, even if you had good estimates, they're out of date. And I don't think the general public understands infrastructure, understands how much infrastructure underpins the success of our economy. And so because of that, right, I think as part of the right general trust to make governments impotent, they come in and say, well, we really have to look at alternative financing for projects. And so you get these P3s, which, when I was a younger version of myself would say, wow, this is great. Everybody's putting in public, private. Yeah, everybody should contribute. But you know what really happens? These projects are not going to go ahead unless there's a financial incentive to make money. So there are corners cut. And then there's also, something I worry about a lot is picking of winners and losers. So you will have certain projects built in certain communities because it's profitable, but people who really need it, like say in Northern Ontario or in any part of Northern Canada where they need a good road, or take anywhere from British Columbia up to the Manitoba-Ontario border that has no Greyhound, right? They need local transportation. Unless somebody figures a route is viable, they're not going to go in. But, if you provide public transportation, that can spur an economy. And this seems to be lost on people. So that's a sad thing. Yvonne, I must say that I was really happy and listened quite attentively when you spoke about the the differences between the socialist movement in BC as opposed to Extinction Rebellion, and some of the shortcomings of both. And that's why in my speech I talked about building a broad coalition, making sure we have education, and that is something that's needed. To the lady, I see she's not here, but who asked about what could be done about students who see the state of affairs normalized. I would say that is not a symptom of not just young people. It's a lot of people who are in precarious work and they're studying just survival. So perhaps one of the antidotes to that is, so for example, if you have an issue of work and a work-related issue that you're fighting in your community, and most of the workers are women, why not offer temporary childcare for the day? Get a group of your activists, sacrifice their time to not be at the struggle, maybe have the kids in a safe area, look after their kids so that these women can come out and participate and get their voices heard, because there's a lot of experts speaking, but there's a lack of people with lived experience. So we have to start thinking a little bit differently. And yes, Yvonne, I would agree too with having young people engaged in talking to other young people. That's important, but we still need talking to the older, more experienced heads, just so that there's a transfer of information. Because my partner Morris and he was exclaiming to me that that's the problem, right? We see people start these movements, but they don't leave something behind for the younger people, and so that's something that needs to be done. I admired Matthew's campaign from afar. I must say, and I finally got to meet him one day, but we didn't have much of a chance to talk. He set a goal of signing up a lot of new members. I think it was 1,000.
30 seconds.
Yeah, which I find was amazing, and that's something I think is bringing members in is something we need to do along with building a movement, because the Conservatives, I was telling somebody, the Conservatives in London, Ontario could run a cardboard cutout and get 30% of the vote. We're doing nothing. This is the first time I saw them have their vote erode, and a lot of it had to do with, believe it or not, this is the first time in the 10 years that I've been canvassing with the NDP that I actually heard people saying, I'm usually conservative, but I will vote for you. And I think some of them probably did, or they stayed home. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I have five speakers on the list. Maybe I can take, yes, I have you. Maybe one more speaker. Okay. Sam, and you're on, Robbie, you already spoke. Sam. Okay, so I'm going to close, Corey. The list is now closed because the hour is getting late and we've got to come back to the panel. So, Rebecca.
Oh, sorry. Maybe, do you want to stand back here a little bit? Because I think this is going to feedback really, really bad. Very good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so for Barry, I have a question. You said that the NDP was able to appoint 100 different candidates, and I'm just wondering how they were able to do that. How come there wasn't any election process for that? And as well, I know that this is something that you've struggled with for quite a while, and that's how do you involve the left in the NDP? How do you get them to be willing to participate in the NDP? Because I hear time and time again, it's just not left enough. They're just liberal lights. There's no point in participating. Durka, as wondering, I'm very interested to hear what you think are the most important building blocks needed to create a strong riding association. What would be the starting focus to get things jump-started? And then, Yvonne, you mentioned that there's a disconnect between people's deeply held beliefs and them getting involved politically. Do you have any suggestions as to how to bridge that gap?
All right, Gary.
And I'm the vice president of my NDP electoral district. Sorry, I'm the vice president of the NDP Electoral District Association that I live in, and we have 4 band councils in our riding. There's 3 municipalities and 4 chiefs, and they together form a group that runs our wider area, which works more or less. But our riding has no indigenous people on it, on its executive. What there is 4 PhDs, 4 post-secondary students, no unionists, no indigenous people, although they constitute a very significant percentage of our riding. And there used to be indigenous people on the riding, and there used to be union members. But the riding doesn't deal with their issues. It's all concerned about electing people, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Because that's the issue between financing all ridings and financing, it's because they want to elect people. They think that if you don't have a parliamentary majority, that you can't get anything done. You can't get anything done in Parliament. I mean, the capitalist state is designed to mitigate against you. Horgan is the Premier of BC, he's a New Democrat. But the NDP, once they get elected, they see themselves as above the class struggle, and they're representing everybody, not just the unions. Well, of course, the unions are the most of society, but what that really means is that they play an intermediate, they play a role that's really in defense of the capitalist class, and we call them a bourgeois government, simple as that. The party is a different institution, but an NDP government is a bourgeois government. That's why we have LNG projects. That's why we had Site C and all that stuff. It's because in the big questions, they come down on the side of the capitalist class. So, and Horgan's now telling the school workers who are on strike that the last offer they got was good enough and they should vote for it. And warning the transit workers, to be wary. He hasn't broken a strike yet. And I doubt if he will, because there's the power of the BC unions is pretty big.
30 seconds.
But the nature of the state, I mean, there's the parliament, there's the military, there's the bureaucracy, there is the financial backers of all these parties. The power of the state is all of these institutions. You can't get elected to parliament and do anything serious unless you've got a mass mobilized working class behind you that can force this to happen. So that's really, the NDP doesn't understand that at all. The NDP leadership wants to work within capitalism and make reforms. Left Social Democrats just want to make more reforms.
Okay, just pass the mic to the comrade next to you, the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate all this conversation. I'd just like to refer to something in regard to Bill Morneau. He's supposed to be, he's a very wealthy man, and he's the Minister of Finance, and one would expect that he would understand investments and costs and all that sort of thing. So maybe you can give me some insight here. He agreed to set up the infrastructure bank, something new in Canada. Surveys across Canada indicated that there was no infrastructure problem in Canada, but if there were such a thing, the Canadian government could raise the necessary revenue at a maximum of 2.5%. So as an example, if we're to discuss $100 million to be repaid over 30 years, at that 2.5%, it would cost $42 million to service the debt. However, with the new infrastructure bank set up by Bill Morneau, he's working with this fellow Larry Fink, BlackRock, who is the manager of a $5 trillion investment fund. Now, these two men, I have a question here, these two men have come together and they have agreed to set up this infrastructure bank, and Morneau has agreed to accept money from BlackRock at between 7 and 9%. So if we talk about $100 million over 30 years at 7%, it would cost $151 million. Quite a bit more than 42 million. And if the percent were to rise to 9% over the 30 years, it would cost $192 million to service the debt. So what sane citizen buying a property would take a mortgage at 7 to 9% when the same mortgage was available for 2% or a maximum 2.5%? So this defies rationality.
30 seconds.
It defies rationality. And yet, here we have the Liberal government doing this, but it didn't announce it publicly. So what kind of shenanigans, what kind of mindset is behind this? I mean, it just defies rationality. It's stupid.
Okay, thank you. Stephen?
Have you heard of SNC Lavalin?
I just wanted to know if Chris is on, because Chris had his hand up before me. Is Chris on the machine?
Not the way I saw it. I'm in the chair, but anyway, if that's how you
Point
want
of
to do
order,
it.
sister, I've had my hand up several times, but you tend to look over there, I think, because I don't know why.
No, I've got you on the
Okay,
list.
okay,
I've got you. If you want him to go first, it's
Oh, I
fine.
don't
I
care.
saw your end and then his.
Yeah, I don't care as long as he's on the list, because I saw him.
Of course he's on the list.
Okay, thank you, sister.
So where are we going?
I don't know Chris's time.
Please let me chair the meeting up here. So who's speaking now, Chris or Stephen?
Go ahead,
Chris, go ahead, Chris.
Okay. Use the mic.
I just want to say, sister, that I really appreciate your very skillful chairing of.
And the check is in the mail?
The New Brunswick NDP has done very poorly lately. They've been at 3% in the polls. They came up to maybe 5% during the last federal election. The local Irving-owned paper wrote an editorial saying to turn the lights out on the NDP in New Brunswick. Anyway, I'm just wondering what if you think the NDP in New Brunswick is worth trying to revive, and if you do, what would you do to try to revive it?
Okay, now, okay, Chris. Stephen. Ready to speak? You're on.
Okay, thanks.
You're on.
Actually, Chris stole my line, but anyway, we'll let that go.
Okay, we'll move on.
No, I think the point about education is really important, and I think Rebecca also brought up the idea of how do we connect the socialist movement to the environmental movement. And I think that's something that, if I'm correct, Jeff might agree with me, that is something that has happened in the States with younger people, that connection between socialism and the green economy has been made pretty clearly. So how do we do that? How do we replicate that in Canada? One thing that I think I've been trying to do within the labor movement is make people realize that Facebook and maybe you'll disagree, Yvonne, I think it's really important. Facebook and social media are very important for reaching out to young people. But nothing is quite as effective as taking it to the streets. And I think that's something that those actions around the climate strike really showed that. When you've got 80,000 people in the streets of Vancouver, it really makes an impression. However, it also has the weaknesses that it could die the same way as the Occupy movement. So what are some ways in which we can make that connection, as Rebecca said? And I'm just wondering too, because hopefully those protests will continue in the streets. When we go there, what is some action that you think, and Durka, you could comment on this as well, that would be effective to connect young people to socialism? Obviously, we don't have to throw names around, but I think that perhaps things like nationalizing things like the fossil fuel industry might be something that would be of interest to younger people. And I'm just wondering about comments on that.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. Sam?
Great presentation, guys. The International Solidarity Office in particular, Dirk, I really like the idea. It kind of aligns with Evan
Yes,
Anger's.
I'm awake now.
the do no harm foreign policy, kind of from Yves Engler's new book, Left Right, that he articulates is kind of in that vein. And it made me think of also the NDP leaving the Socialist International, which is a terrible organization, no less, but there should have been a discussion about it, right? And educate rank and file members that there even is something called a Socialist International that the NDP once belonged to. And, oh yeah, why did we take socialism out of our constitution when it is a growing trend among young people, and it's the future, right? The conversation made me think of Rosa Luxemburg's The Mass Strike a bit, and that social democracy and the trade unions are fundamentally intertwined and are not necessarily independent of each other in any sort of way. She talked about in her time in 1905 in Germany how the trade unions the social democratic minded trade unions have been able to gain members tenfold over their other religious and kind of bourgeois kind of craft unions because of the power and narrative of the class struggle. And their ability to articulate this vision of society and win battles on this. And bourgeois-minded liberals, I think of people in my own family, are terrified of this organic and natural connection between some aspect of social democracy and the workers' movement, that the unions actually have a party that we vote for. And they decry how it's an injustice at every turn, and how do you think you can take people's money and spend it? The trade unions are only independent working class organizations that we have in a sense. The NDP's to an extent, but it's also very corrupted. So do you see that organic connection coming back, or is it moving away? You see Unifor that unapologetically voted liberal this campaign. Fucking travesty, excuse my language. But it's just so disgusting that it just makes you think, is this organic connection getting broken down over time, or do you see it kind of coming back in the way that Corbyn in a way has reignited, and maybe Corbyn's victory will really is a hopeful victory coming up will really expose the kind of nakedness of the NDP brass. I remember just to end off, I remember having conversations with members of the NDP brass just that I came across. Don't ask me where or how, and I had mentioned, and this was years ago, but I mentioned Bernie and Corbyn, and the individual I was talking to kind of stepped back, and I thought, and I just sort of got into social democratic politics. I thought, this is a senior member from the NDP, and they're not down with Bernie or Corbyn. Like, who the hell are these guys, right? So that organic connection between the movement is powerful and something that we really focus on. Thank you.
Okay, last speaker, Corey.
Thanks. I'm from Scarborough Southwest, and I just want to talk about the campaign there. We had a person who was not really a member of the NDP up until recently run for office, run for the candidacy unopposed, Keith McGrady, an Indigenous person who's an educational worker, and they were a very nice person. But I mean, I think they relied a lot on their personality, and there was not really. The riding association didn't really try to find someone even within the association that was more politically active. I heard at debates that it was very soft. He didn't do well. He didn't really challenge. What's his name? The former police chief, Bill Blair, is the incumbent Liberal MP there. Anyways, yeah, he's awful.
G20 Bill.
Yeah, exactly. All kinds of homophobia and crap like that. Anyways, but I think that's indicative, sort of where the NDP was, in 2015 under Mulcair, sort of, not challenging the other parties really, like we said, Liberal light. And I think that it really didn't bring out people. Like people I talked to, like, oh, I like Keith. He's a really nice guy. But they didn't really think about ideas about what the campaign was, what the party was about, what we should be campaigning for, how we should change things. And it's really frustrating because in the provincial election, the Dolly Begum, who's now the MPP for that riding, NDP, won by I think almost 2,000 votes. Like she had a pretty good victory, and to kind of squander that victory in the federal election, right? I mean, it's a little bit misleading maybe because in Toronto, like it goes red, orange all over the place all the time. Like people blow with the wind. But I just think it's something to think about, that we really need to be centering our party around confronting things, right? And like it's nice that Jagmeet Singh left Quebec's sovereignty up for them to decide what to do with Bill 21. But like many people pointed out, he should have taken that opportunity to really stridently come out and be like, we're really against this, but we're going to do it by convincing people, by arguing for it, that this is not right, not by forcing Quebec to do something. And that leads into my other point, which is Jagmeet Singh is really a federalist, and he's not for sovereignty of Quebec or of Indigenous groups, and that led to a lot of debates that I saw within Indigenous communities on who they wanted to support or if they were going to support anybody. Is that the NDP does not support Indigenous sovereignty. I mean, to a point, I guess, right, but not all the way, which is a problem, and definitely does not support Quebec sovereignty, although they want to open up the Constitution to bring them into it. And then this leads to my final question for people that are involved in XR, Yvonne. What are the connections with Indigenous communities within XR? Because I've seen tons of, obviously, Indigenous land defenders, water defenders, protests and demonstrations and blockades, and then you've seen a lot of Extinction Rebellion blockades, but I haven't seen a connection between the two, and I don't know what it is exactly, so I'd like more information on that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we're going to go back to the panel.
Can I give a 30 seconds information to everybody here for 30
20 seconds.
Okay.
Talk fast.
It's in today's newspaper. Anne McGrath. She's meeting with the Liberals' Katie Telford. She has a history of working together that may bode well for cooperation of the two parties. This is Anne McGrath who worked with Mulcair. This is Anne McGrath who was around in 2008 when the NDP bloc deal was formed. This is the McGrath that was served as a top advisor to Premier Rachel Notley. The faces are the same. The names are the same. It's the same people running the party as before.
That's right. Okay, coming back to our panel, I'm giving them up to 8 minutes each to speak, and it's going to be Durka, Yvonne, and Barry.
Hi, okay. Rebecca, you asked about what I think would be a strong riding association. So I believe I started out in a strong riding association. It's called London West. When I got there, London has 3 ridings that encompass the city itself, and a 4th that is mostly rural, but encompasses the southern and rural part of the city mostly. And so I was in London West, and at the time we had only one NDP member elected either at federal or provincial level, and that was Irene Matheson, federally in London Fanshawe. And so London West as well as London North Centre were Liberal strongholds. London West tended to also elect Conservatives, but not anywhere near as, but London North Centre was really more of a Liberal stronghold. What I observed is that, first of all, they did a few things. Our riding association is a little bit of a boring thing, if you right, because it's an administrative vehicle. You have to maintain Elections Canada's rules, as well as you have to communicate with the party, right? So you have to have people who are prepared to do that kind of boring work. And I think you must have active committees. So we had active social fundraising outreach policy. So that was something that was a thing. The social part is really important, as well as the fundraiser, because, and you can combine the both, or sometimes you can do each one separately. But that is the way I think social things, and not everything has to revolve around alcohol, is way how you bring in people, by doing fun things. And what they also do is, you're going to have some natural turnover, but you have to make sure you maintain a nucleus of people who will always be there all the time. And how I got involved is because someone who is I would call her a matriarch of London West, she's now passed on, her name is Gina Barber. I said to her, and I didn't even say that I was interested in the NDP. All I just said to her is, I'm interested in politics. And she was at the time controller, a member of the board of control in London. And I went to Irene's, Jack Layton came to Irene's party and spoke, and I met someone else from London West, and they both together, they followed up with me. So you have to always be on the outlook for people and keep building, like you always build. And they encouraged me as a new member. I started out as a member at large in 2009, and by 2013, I was the Riding Association president. Until I stepped down in 2015. It was a tough time to be a president, because both provincially and federally, we were in minority situations, right? And so you're always going, but that's what I think are some of the elements. There may be more people can add. I think there was somebody here who Gary, you said you were Writing Association president, which brings me to your discussion about this. So I was telling Barry earlier today that there were 6 people who ran in London North Centre, and of those 6, I, who have a master's degree in engineering, was the second least educated person. We have a problem with elitism in politics, and that does not exclude the NDP. It's a problem, because if we only think that people like myself or people with PhDs are electable, we're in trouble. What is wrong? You know, smartness doesn't depend on money, right? And there's some very intelligent people who have lived experience of poverty. And we ought to be on the outlook for people's commitment and understanding of the cause, rather than just perceived electability, because they may not want to do the hard work that it takes to build a movement, right? Or to even be a candidate, a candidate that really is in it, you know, to win it. I guess if you want to use Andrea's thing. I mean, it's concerning, right? And that's why I say I listened to Dr. Jill Andrew today in the Women's Caucus at Provincial Convention, and she said, you know, a lot of people believe people should come to Queen's Park, but it's better for Queen's Park to go to them. And I think that's what we have to do in a strong riding association. That I don't think I mentioned that earlier, but a lot of the members were activists in electoral reform. Gina herself was, when she got older, became a champion for an age-friendly city. There were people who were concerned about environmentalism, women's rights, things like that. So all of those attributes combined make a good riding association, and you have to genuinely try to seek out, because there will be people who are indigenous, who are like me, are black, you know, have a disability, who genuinely want to be involved, and we have to make sure we accommodate them. The New Brunswick NDP. I don't know much about New Brunswick, but it sounds like and I mentioned that in my talk, they have been very neglected. They've also been hard done by people who were supposed to be trusted. Like, I understand the leader went and defected to the Conservative Party of all
1
things.
minute.
So, you know, that is...
For that.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. So that is a very big problem. If we really truly want to have both a mass movement and gain electoral power to at least make some transformative changes, we have to fight everywhere. And I think, you know, we have to somehow figure out a strategy to save New Brunswick. I won't comment on the other things, but yeah.
So yeah, the first question that I wrote down was how to bridge the gap between people getting involved politically and people getting involved in activism. And yeah, Dirk, I think you made a great point about elitism. It is a huge problem, and it does hold a lot of people back. People who feel really comfortable in the activist movement because it's relatively anonymous. When you're out protesting, you're in a massive crowd, you're not really expected to have the prerequisite knowledge that you need if you're wanting to get involved in politics. And we also have this sort of perception of politicians as being, and this is probably not a real word, but like mythologized figures who we hold to a greater standard than regular people, and we expect more of them than regular people. And in fact, we think that they are more than regular people, which they're not. And so, you know, that perception leads to people thinking, you know, I would love to do that, but I never could because, you know, I'm too young, or I'm too poor, or I don't have an education, or whatever, right? So we need to really lead by example in combating that mythologization, that making myths out of politicians. And all we can do there is lead by example. We can't say, you could do it, but I can't. You have to say, you can do it, and I can do it, and I'll show you. And that's what I think all of the people who ran as candidates in this room did. We said, look, anyone can do it, and we're gonna do it. I remember lying in bed after having like a kind of argument, or not argument, but just a rant about, you know, the NDP and the problems that I see in the NDP and like what I would love to fix, and like, you know, no one's even running in Vancouver Granville, and like, you know, they have this big empty space and it's been empty for like weeks, and like, what's going on? I'm gonna run. And I was lying in bed and I was like, you know what? I could run. And I did. And if we have more activists doing that, more people in like diverse communities with a diverse range of ideas and beliefs and connections, we can really, really make something happen. So yeah, lead by example. What mindset underlies the Canada Infrastructure Bank? I don't know much about that, but from what you described, I want to say it's the C word, and not capitalism, corruption. How to get people out into the streets to protest was Stephen's question. What actions would be effective to help unite socialist and climate movements? So yeah, I mean, I talked a bunch about social media and like the impact that can have, and you know, if we mobilize messaging, reject moralistic messaging, you know, everything's blamed on this moral crisis. You know, immigration, it's a moral crisis, addiction, moral crisis, homelessness, moral crisis, it's all moral failings, and that really makes it so that we don't have to look at the actual problems that are causing these. You know, we're saying people don't have the moral fortitude to surpass their situation, and we don't really ask why they're in that situation in the first place and what the system is doing to put them there. So, you know, messaging has a huge role to play, but that's laying the foundations. That's teaching apolitical people that, look, you have this relatable problem, you know, and memes do this. Here's your relatable situation, and here's how it connects to working class struggle and socialist doctrine. And that's super valuable, but it is just foundation. It gets people out into the streets. Once we are in the streets, what do we want to be doing? Well, I was serious. Like, I think we should be stepping up the direct action and like taking banks and like sitting in private institutions and saying, look, like if the state is not going to take these, we're going to take them. I think that's going to be the next step if we want to maintain the kind of expansion and increasing operations of the activist movement. And finally, the question was connections with Indigenous communities, between Indigenous communities and Extinction Rebellion. And in Vancouver, you know, I've read a lot of criticisms online from Indigenous folk about, you know, the environmentalist movement in general being, you know, not having space for them, even though they are like the traditional of the traditional land defenders. Absolutely, like water is sacred is like part of a lot of Indigenous communities' doctrines. But in Vancouver, I think there's been at least somewhat of a response to that in the environmental movement, and a lot of the more represented activists have kind of stepped back. And in the last climate strike, there was a huge feature of, they're called Tiny House Warriors, and they're a group of Indigenous, they're an Indigenous-led group who's been camping out on the Marine Gateway Terminal, which is where the expansion of the pipeline is going to end. And just blocking the pipeline with their bodies and with their actions. And they were, featured very prominently on stage, and hopefully will continue to be featured extremely prominently in the climate action movement. It's really nice to see like a very high concentration of Indigenous people in the movement, in the rallies and on stage, doing speeches and things like that, because you know, they're voices that unfortunately you just don't get to hear in your daily life, and being able to hear them in the context of saving the environment and preserving this beautiful land that we live on is really incredible and really necessary. Yeah.
What a great discussion we're having. And isn't it indicative of the fact that we must be doing something right if we have folks like this involved in the discussion here, such as we're having here tonight. Thank you, Rebecca, for your questions. I'm going to try to answer each of them. How was it that Jagmeet Singh and the staff that he appointed to run the campaign and to run the federal party were able to appoint around 100 candidates? And how do I know that that's the number? Well, we know that about 20 days before the election, and that's an important date on the electoral calendar, there were 100 electoral districts without a candidate. Now, what happens after that critical date? After that critical date, the leader can appoint candidates. There's no need to hold local meetings. Meetings can be held, but if it's inconvenient, then the leader can simply appoint. why were no meetings held? Why were so many meetings not held in electoral districts prior to that? Why were they not held in March, April, May, June, July, August, early September? Because they chose not to do so. I signaled an interest in contesting for the nomination in University of Rosedale here back in, what was it, March or April? And there was no response for a month and a half, so I called the federal office and I was told the person heading up the candidate search committee had resigned suddenly, and they were in a bit of a mess and they were going to appoint someone and get onto it. But 2 or 3 more months passed until they finally dealt with the paperwork and they said that I hadn't disclosed some information. What was the information? That I had run in a provincial election 42 years earlier as a revolutionary Marxist candidate of a radical student group at University of Toronto in Riverdale in the Ontario election 42 years earlier. Frankly, I had forgotten. But I'm not sure this had much bearing on the 2019 election. Anyway, this was a decision by a very controlling political leadership. And that's a problem that we need to address in the review of the whole situation going into the next federal convention as we look at the nomination process. We need to make it much more driven by the rank and file from the bottom up rather than from the top down. How do we get the, I just want to mention one other thing. Have you heard about what happened in Parkdale High Park? Saron Gebrselassie, a woman of color who was an outstanding candidate for mayor of Toronto, I think she came 3rd, sought the nomination there. She signed up 360 individuals to NDP membership in Parkdale High Park. At the nomination meeting, they would not allow, the people running the meeting would not allow most of them to be seated and to exercise the right to vote in that nomination. They said that they couldn't find their membership cards. The NDP prefers that the membership be achieved through the internet. You could, pay your money with plastic, you do it online, and then it's in an archive. Well, these people signed up in person, signature on a card, the cards were submitted and somehow lost or not processed in time. So hundreds of people, many of them from Africa, were kept out of the room. A few were allowed in at the last minute when they started to shout and stamp, and a lot of them had already gone home, so they allowed 40 or 50 into the room, but it didn't tip the scales in favor of Saron. And I think that's a blot against the party's reputation in that district and beyond. And some 350 of them have filed a lawsuit against the federal NDP for that misconduct in the way the nomination meeting was conducted. So I just wanted to indicate that. How do we get the left to participate in the NDP? Well, I would make 3 quick points. Number 1, the radical left, if we're talking about the left which is decidedly to the left of the NDP, is very, very small. A good chunk of it is in the room here now. Maybe you could double or triple this in terms of our base, but it's not a deal breaker if we can't get the radical left to get involved in the NDP. It would be nice, and we always try to do it, but that's not the key thing. Secondly, it is useful in terms of the idea that we don't have to agree on everything in order to work together. This is an idea that we honor from the 1920s to the present. It's called the United Front. And Socialist Action is a very strong partisan of this concept of getting people together who don't agree on anything except the task at hand or a defined set of policies. And that's the basis in which we build the Socialist Caucus and also the basis in which we build the Workers' Action Movement. So, let's get together on what we do agree and let's try to effect change in the main institutions of the working class. Why? Why in those institutions? Because they have the means to address millions of people. Where we can address thousands, but those organizations can address millions, and we think that's where politics begins, among millions of people, as Fidel and Lenin and others have said classically. Thirdly, we argue for a working class orientation. So for people on the radical left or in the center left, if they may not like NDP policies or past practice. They may consider it a corrupt organization. But the thing is, if you want to affect change, and if you accept that individuals don't do it, masses make change on a big scale, then you need to have a class orientation. And our orientation is to the working class. And the working class has a political party in this country, at least in English Canada. And if you're serious about affecting political change on a broad scale, you have to be oriented towards the NDP and the unions, or you're just talking to yourself. Gary, thanks for reminding us that an NDP government is a bourgeois government. Chris, is it worth reviving the NDP in New Brunswick? Yes. And we should do that. And you almost did it single-handedly. You were in a meeting with 20 people, and you ran for leader when the leader had resigned, and you almost won it. I don't know what would have happened had you succeeded, but I think you're on the right track. But next time, you got to take 100 people to the meeting with you, and advance the policies of the Socialist Caucus. I think it will put you in good stead. Sam, the NDP left the Socialist International without a discussion. You're right, the Socialist International is a pretty reprehensible political outfit, but there should have been a discussion. So it would have been enlightening for the party membership to understand why the party should remain or stay. Have that discussion. So the members were deprived of that opportunity, and that's sad. Is the organic connection of unions to the NDP weakening? Yes, it is. But for the very same reason that the Labour leadership is negotiating two-tier. For the very same reason that the Labour leadership is engaged in concessions bargaining. For the very same reason that the Labour leadership does not take on the fight against frozen wages, deteriorating benefits, and declining pensions. Pensions are increasingly privatized. But there's no fight around that. So it's the very same reasons. If you're going to change one, you have to change the other. And change in either direction will have a mutually reinforcing effect, and that's why we're engaged in it. So what is to be done in conclusion? To overcome the crisis of labor at the bargaining table, in society, in the Labour Party, in every aspect of Canada? Well, the Socialist Caucus is the voice of socialism in the NDP. The Workers' Action Movement is the voice of union democracy and class struggle unionism in the unions. We need to be continuing to build up and press forward campaigns that challenge for leadership and fight for the policies that will serve the interests of our class, of the vast majority. And in conclusion, I'm going to put in a plug now for upcoming events. On November the 24th, the Ontario Federation of Labour is hosting an educational for young workers. And it appears that any young worker can attend. You don't even have to be a member of a union, much less a delegate to the OFL. So on November 24th, at the Sheraton Centre Hotel on Queen Street opposite City Hall, we're going to have as many of the young worker members of Socialist Action go to that meeting, learn, distribute information for the Workers' Action Movement slate of candidates. On November 25th, Grey Cup Day, the registration, go Ticats, registration for the Ontario Federation of Labour Convention takes place also at the Sheraton, and we're going to have a team of 10 or 15 or 20 socialists there promoting the WAM slate, promoting the socialist press. And the 26th and 27th, and that whole week is the OFL convention, and the election is on the 27th, which is the Tuesday, and we need folks.
Off by a day, Barry.
Pardon me?
You're off by a day. The meeting's the 23rd. We're going to be canvassing on the 24th. 25th is a Monday.
Okay, the 25th is the Monday, and the 26th is the election.
Yes.
Thank you for that correction. Sam is on the ball. That's why he's got the calendar there right in front of him. So we're going to be there all week, and we have a display table already arranged, but we need as many of you as possible. Whether you're a member of WAM or Socialist Caucus or Socialist Action or not, doesn't matter. If you want to help progress, if you want to fight for gains for the working class in the labor movement, that's the important starting point for this effort. Please join us at the Sheraton Centre on those days. The 23rd, 24th, 25th, and 26th are very important days affecting the future of the labor movement in this province.
Here, here.